So here we are in the p38a Range Rover. It's one of those Range Rovers that I think it's a love or hate. It was the first revision of the classic, iconic Range Rover that had been known for many decades. On the flip side, I think this is some positives for the vehicle. It managed to retain all of the classic lines of the original vehicle. It still is very much a Range Rover, but addressed all the weak points. But as with any vehicle, there's always going to be those detractors and haters that didn't like the change or what the vehicle became. So I think over the years the p38 has perhaps been much maligned. It was also of an era where cars were fully embracing ECUs and electronic control for everything. So while it was highly sophisticated in its day, it has proven to be quite problematic with lots and lots of issues that can occur with them. As we are now, several decades on from the launch, the aftermarket has catered very well for pretty much every aspect of the vehicle. So while you can still have problems, they are at least addressable by the home mechanic. So what is the p38? Well, Land Rover decided to update the Range Rover. I think they were unsure how to do it for many years, and the model remained largely the same throughout its entire production run, right up until the launch of the LSE model, which had a stretch wheelbase to 108 inches over the 100-inch standard Range Rover, and also gained electronic air suspension, which was the first for Land Rover at the time. So when you look at the p38, you can see it's very much that makeup. We've got the same 108-inch wheelbase, we have electronic air suspension, it's just wrapped up in a very new package. So while I say the p38 does retain all of those classic Range Rover lines and style, they do look very much like a Range Rover. There's no mistaking them for anything else on the road. It was all new. We've got a brand new chassis compared to the old model. It is still a body-on-frame ladder chassis, but it is all new. The same with the axles. They share some commonality with the axles you would find on a Defender or a Range Rover Classic or a Discovery. But indeed they are very, very different. In fact, the diff actually sits on the opposite side of the axle, and the actual makeup of the axle is quite different, as is the suspension. So we still have a live axle system in the vehicle. This is the last live axle Range Rover to be produced by Land Rover. But it uses a very, very different setup in comparison to past models. The key difference being the air suspension, but also the radius arm design. On past models you'd have had a A-frame at the back, which is sort of part way between being a 3 and a 4 link setup. The A-frame sits in the middle and acts as a top link, so you don't have the C-cup radius arms on the rear of a classic Range Rover. On this you do have radius arms at the back, and it uses a panhard rod. All the body's new, it's still made out of aluminium or Burma bright, and all the interior's new compared to the outgoing model. And I say we had a whole array of electronics to complement the vehicle. Early models got rear wheel traction control, which is basically being an electronic simulation of a limited slip differential, while in 1999 onwards, all the vehicles received four-channel traction control, which makes them very capable off-road. I think over the years, people have found the air suspension to be quite problematic. I must confess, it's something I've faced as well, and I even threw the towel in. But we'll come back to that later on. This particular model is a 4.6. This is quite a special model in a way, because this is actually a 4.6 HSE that was taken off the production line by Land Rover's SVO, Special Vehicle Operations Department, and was actually converted into a Vogue SE as that line was just being introduced. So this model has some unique features on it, being sort of a midway stage between the two model ranges. So one of those changes is the fact that we do have the 4-channel traction control on this model, but we also have the later Thor or Bosch injection system. We can have a look under the bonnet in a bit, and you can sort of see what that looks like. So the early 4.6 models, Land Rover rated at 225 horsepower, and they used the same fuel injection system as the Discovery ones and the past Range Rover Classics. I believe it's called GEMS system, if you're familiar with Rover nomenclature. I believe Land Rover were actually taken to court in the USA for the vehicles not producing the claimed 225 horsepower, and they did do a series of recalls and aftermarket work to bring the power up. As far as my knowledge goes, here in the United Kingdom there were no such recalls, so my belief is that those vehicles never made 225 horsepower. They were probably nearer sort of 200, maybe 210 horsepower. The later Bosch or Thor engines were rated at an official 214 horsepower, and I believe that really was the ultimate solution to the underperforming earlier variants. It would seem very strange for Land Rover to invest lots of money in updating the engine so you actually have it producing less power than before. So I feel fairly confident in saying that the later vehicles, 99 onwards, are the most powerful V8s for this generation of Range Rover. This particular vehicle has been on a rolling road dyno earlier this year, and it was very nice to see that it was actually making right around the sort of 215 horsepower mark estimated flywheel. Which is quite good. It shows that the vehicle is still running well after all these years. This particular model is 899 and we're in 2020, so it's a 21-year-old vehicle. We've got 90,000 miles on the clock, but I think it's been reasonably well cared for during its lifetime. Other models in the lineup, they also did a 4-litre V8, which was rated at around 182 horsepower. That would be a very similar engine to what you'd find in a Discovery 2 of a similar era. The only real defining feature there is that the 4-litre was offered with the 5-speed R380 manual gearbox, which is quite a rare vehicle, but very nice that we do have one. Whereas the 4.6 exceeded the torque rating for the R380 gearbox, so the 4.6 is only come with the 4-speed auto, and it's actually the ZF HP24 box with the 4.6, which is slightly stronger. The 4-litre and the diesel both got the HP22, which is mostly the same, but it is a weaker box, and I think 20 years on, people are suffering some gearbox failures these days. On that note, the diesel version, which wouldn't have been sold in the USA, I don't believe, had a BMW straight 6 2.5 litre turbo diesel engine. My memory's playing tricks on me. I think it's something like an M52 engine. Had around 136-ish horsepower. So at the time of launch, it was the most powerful diesel vehicle that Land Rover had produced, although the p38 was indeed heavier than the outgoing Range Rover Classic. So I think the performance was quite marginal on the difference between the old model and the new one. I think a lot of people also didn't like how the BMW engine developed its power. I think it was very much nothing, then here's all your power and no more. So I think there were quite a lot of complaints that it didn't suit the manual gearbox. That was the standard spec for the vehicle. So most of the diesels you'll find are with the 4-speed auto, although the performance is indeed quite sluggish with a non-chip tuned 2.5 diesel in one of these. The 4.6 on the other hand is quite sprightly. You have to pedal it a bit, but if you make use of the rev range, they really perform well for a big old bus. I think we're weighing in at around 2,000 kilos, 2 ton. But we're still quite sprightly, and even jumping from a brand new Defender 110 first edition D240, you don't really feel that short change getting into this performance wise. I think the 8-speed auto in the modern vehicles does give those vehicles a slight edge, but we can rock it out of junctions quite nicely with this, and it'll, where it's legal, you can shoot up to 90 mile an hour quite happily. I think they tend to run out of gearing and revs from that point on. They're not really designed for triple figure speeds, but they will get there. For anybody who goes on to the continent and drives on the autobahns in Germany, you're not limited to just being at 65, 70. You can set the cruise at 90 or even 95 if you wanted to. Just don't look at your fuel consumption. So what else can we say about the p38? Well, I know the diesel models suffer with cracked heads and hot start problems. In fact, looking at the forums, I think the EAS, or electronic air suspension, is definitely the #1 problem child with these. But then I think the diesel engine is probably the second. Unless you're buying one of these to be a daily driver where you really need that extra MPG, I think the V8s are probably the way to go. Either a 4.6 or a manual 4 litre if you can find one. And of course with the 4.6 you're generally getting a higher spec vehicle, so you get a nicer interior than you're going to get on a base model diesel. I can't say I've been immune from problems with this. So this isn't my first foray with p38s. My father had a brand new 4.6 way back in, I think it was 1996. It would have been on a P plate in the UK, which fortunately I got to drive quite a lot. As a family, we then had another 4.6 in the early 2000s. Again, we never really had any problems with that at all. That was a lovely vehicle. And I've owned this particular vehicle for about 5 years now. And the first 3 years I had no trouble whatsoever, and then unfortunately I've hit a series of problems. I don't think all of them can be blamed on the vehicle itself. I had a 12-volt battery that I think internally failed and did some electrical damage, and since then I've been unable to get any of the key fobs to work. Although I do believe part of the root cause is perhaps the driver's door lock, which has electronic switches in it. I know there are some people who actually specialise in rebuilding the door handle and door lock, which I think would be quite beneficial to do one day. I've had a little bit of trouble with the aircon, so at the moment I'm just running it without the gas in it, but everything else seems to work not too bad in that area, apart from the other big problem with these, which is the blend motors. So these mix the warm and cold air and help direct it through to the different ducts from the heater for if you want it out of the windscreen or at your feet. I think they're made out of cheese, and the gears actually break inside the mechanisms. Unfortunately, it's a dash-out job to replace them, which is just sort of horrendous to do. So horrendous I've not even bothered attempting it myself. I tend just to leave the controls on one setting. But I never bought this to be a premium upmarket vehicle. I bought it as an affordable 4-seat 4x4 that can go over the fields. What else has happened? I've had the water pump fail on this. It was unfortunately a reasonably catastrophic failure. It was actually the nose bearing on the water pump that failed, where the viscous fan couples. So we ended up with the viscous fan flailing about under the bonnet. Also meant removal was very, very challenging indeed. But I've got that sorted. And then sadly it's the air suspension. So I think one of the biggest perks and appeals of a p38 is having air suspension on them. It certainly was for me. It was one of my criteria. That my girlfriend didn't like getting into lifted Land Rovers. So I bought this because it lowers itself down, easy to get in, or at least so I thought. But unfortunately I did just hit problem after problem, and it worked out to be quite a lot cheaper in the end to put a coil kit on it. So I do lament the fact that I've lost the air suspension. I would have liked to have retained that, but it just hasn't been. And to be honest, the vehicle actually goes better in many respects by not having the air suspension fitted. We are actually on the lift kit, so despite the fact of buying this not to be lifted, I've completely gone against all of that, and we're now running the bigger mud terrains and we're lifted. But it doesn't roll much. I think the body control is actually better now than it was on air suspension. And the ride, not quite as supple, but you know, it's not bad. It's not bad, it's a comfortable vehicle still. You know, you can get in it and you can drive it all day and you're not going to feel fatigued. And to be honest, the air suspension was a little bit of a compromise system anyhow. So I don't know how familiar any of you guys are with how it works, but basically you have an air spring that gets inflated to raise the ride height, which sounds fine in principle, but the problem is that when the vehicle's low, so you have your normal ride height setting, but you also have a motorway or high speed setting where it lowers itself down, it softens up the suspension, which kind of seems odd because, you know, if you want to go for a spirited drive, you kind of want the centre of gravity and your roll centre to be lower. You know, if you look it down in the low mode, but actually it rolls a lot when you're in that mode because the suspension is so soft. The sad side effect is in the normal ride height, actually the suspension doesn't ride as well because it's raised up and the air springs are all stiffer. And then worst of all, when you actually want to go off-road and you put it into the off-road ride height or extended ride height, it makes the air springs very, very stiff, which not only potentially limits how well it wants to flex off-road, but it also makes the ride incredibly bad. So if you're going across what we'd have of green lanes in the UK, or if you're sort of four-wheeling in the US or out on some tracks somewhere, you don't want it in the raised ride height because it is just so uncomfortable. The vehicle will automatically lower itself down if you go too quick in that mode, but even the speeds it does allow you to run at, it is just uncomfortable. And generally off-road, you do notice how stiff the air springs are. So it was really a bit of a design error on the air suspension. There is an aftermarket company called Arnott. They do some replacement air springs which do address this. They're called their Generation 3 or Gen 3 air springs, and they basically use a cone-shaped piston so that as you raise the vehicle up, you still have to inflate the air spring, but it has a smaller surface area, the actual piston area touching the air spring. So in theory, you get a softer spring raised up, and you get a stiffer spring when the vehicle is in its lower ride height. I've never been in such a vehicle. Reviews are far and few between, but what I have seen of it, that does sound very promising. But unfortunately, to buy a full set of Arnott springs to put on one of these is likely to cost you more than actually buying an entire second-hand p38 Range Rover, which is frankly madness. So while interested in doing that, I didn't actually opt for that. Other problems with the air suspension are, of course, if it fails, the vehicle actually drops down onto the bump stops. Now the bump stops are actually rubberised springs, so they are designed to be driven on for a short period, but they are ever so uncomfortable. But if you fit slightly larger tyres, you do have the problem that the tyres will then rub a lot or even be jammed inside the wheel wells. This is something I found. When we do an outside tour of the vehicle, we'll be able to see this. You know, I did go up not a lot, marginally increase the tyre size in the hope of being able to retain the air suspension and not have any problems. But on the few occasions when it has crashed at the bump stops, and it's not necessarily been just an ECU fault that I can reset, you know, I've had a catastrophic mechanical failure of the air suspension. you are really quite stuck, and it ends up damaging the tyres to try and move the vehicle. So I caught some coil springs, that's just not a problem. And had I known I was going to go for coils, I'll be honest, I might have gone for a slightly taller tyre than I have with it. But overall, I'm not dissatisfied with any of those points. So, I've rambled on now for way too long, and I'll probably have to edit this video. But what's the P38 like to drive? Well, really nice. It drives like a Range Rover. As said, they're quite comfortable. This is a 20-year-old example, so we do have a few creaks and rattles, but actually the ride itself is quite compliant. Certainly not a nasty place to be. One thing you will notice straight away when you get on these is you have a very, very low waistline. So the window line is nice and low, and you really do feel like you're up high and you can see out. You've got a nice big glass house on these, which is just really lacking in modern car design, and especially modern Land Rover products. I think they handle really well, whether you've got the air suspension or not. Bit of a strange handling trait with the air suspension. You'll notice when you turn into a corner, the air springs will sort of compress a little bit. You'll get quite a bit of initial body roll, and then they stiffen up. I think that's just a function of how the air compresses. You almost end up with an air bump stop inside the actual air spring to some extent. And you don't tend to get out of the coils, it just tends to sort of corner a bit more level and then more gradual body roll. I think it's a real shame that Land Rover never fitted the superb ACE active cornering enhancement system from the Discovery 2. I think if it had that on this vehicle with the air suspension, that would have been an absolute weapon. It would have gone really, really well on the road. As it is, it feels like you want to waft in these. They never really encourage you to drive hard, and they probably waft better than any vehicle I've ever driven, and that does include some of the newer Land Rover products. I'm not saying it's as capable, but it's just the sense of occasion you get when you drive this. It feels stately, I think is the word I would use, and it feels like a 4x4. Whereas a lot of the modern all-independent setups really just feel like estate cars, which just doesn't really appeal to me. We've got the 4-speed auto, we've got sport mode on it. I'd have to say for 4 gears it's quite responsive. You've only got to just sort of put your foot down a little bit and it's absolutely instant. It's one of my bugbears of modern vehicles, the modern 6, 7 and 8 speed ZF boxes. Most of the time they seem horrendously slow, especially if you go to wide open throttle. You know, if you really want to put your foot down, you do that and they have a big think time and then they sort of drop 3 gears and off you go. The old gearbox, you put your foot down and it's just instant. So, I'm not sure if you can tell on the video, but we have got a little bit of a sportier exhaust note as well on this particular example. The exhaust needed some repair work. It was actually all original on there, so I decided to liven it up a bit. Not everybody's choice or taste. Some people do prefer quieter vehicles, but for me, I like the V8 burble that you get. It's not too intrusive, although this is probably on the louder side of what most people would normally want. We'll see if we can get out of this junction. So as I say, the performance on these is actually really good. I mean, we've had no trouble pulling out there, and that's something I'd like to pick up on again. I drove that new Defender. It was a D240 diesel. We couldn't have done that in that vehicle because when you put your foot down, it doesn't do anything for 2 seconds at least. In this, it just went straight away off the line. I'm not saying it is as quick as the new D240, but I certainly don't feel shortchanged by driving this, except for perhaps at the pump where we're about 10 mpg less. But yeah, these old 4-speed electronic automatics just seem to be brilliant. They work, they're nearly always in the right gear. Apologies, we've got some stuff sliding about on the dash there. That's actually just a solar panel that I have just to keep the battery topped up. As I say, these do have a few electrical gremlins, especially at this age in life. So that's just there to keep the battery topped up. Something else you might notice if you do throw these around the corners is this little rubber tray here. It's been on every model, they never changed it, but if you go around corners quick, that would slide about the dash as well. Quite an odd design choice really. They never did anything about it. But again, I think that just reinforces the fact that this vehicle was designed for wafting, not racing. And when you waft in it, it just does it so well. And, you know, hand on heart, I think it's something that's been lost in the newer models. Even the L322s, I've driven a few of those. Exceptionally good vehicles, but they have a very, very different sense of occasion to the older models. This just feels like a Range Rover. It feels like it could be the 1970s Range Rover, just updated, which is really what it was. We've got very little wind noise. I've actually got the sunroof open and one of the rear windows. But even having that open, the wind noise is still actually very low. But we've got all rounded edges and no big water gutters on the roof that you got on the original model. What else can I say? If you fancy an old Range Rover, don't look past the p38a. They have the shortest production run of any Range Rover, because when BMW bought Land Rover, they quite quickly used the Range Rover to develop the L322 model, which also underpins the BMW X5. So I think the p38 had a truncated lifespan over what it might have done. And of course it is that iconic, it's that last live axle Range Rover produced by the Land Rover company. You know, and it will always retain that, because I can't see them going back to live axles, certainly not a model of this calibre. And these are great. I love the interior styling, very Britishness about the styling. Again, I think that's something that was perhaps lost in the L322 onwards. The interiors became far more BMW looking, or German looking, and that holds right through to today really. They've kind of lost that stately home appeal that the older vehicles had. And in terms of the interior, my only real complaint with it is the fact that you have no cup holders in here. I think in the 1990s there was a bit of a British anti-reasoning to have cup holders. It was seen as a very much an Americanism, that American cars had cup holders in, and it's like, why would you want to drink in a car? So this is designed without anywhere to put a bottle of water or a cup, which is a shame, because it is quite handy if you are doing touring or long distance, to be able to have a drink somewhere. But really with the interior, that's probably my only complaint. The seats are really comfortable, the leather's nice, it's got some good looking wood in here, I've got some soft touch plastics, and in terms of the switchgear, everything works. Not had any issues with the switchgear at all, and I don't think it's a problem at all. And this is by no means a mint example of the vehicle. You know, unfortunately, while I say I think it's had quite a good life and been looked after for quite a while, it's also been subjected to a bit of abuse and a bit of unlucky circumstances, where some damage has been caused not due to the owner or the vehicle's fault, but by third parties. But yeah, they're definitely a vehicle I would recommend, as long as you're prepared that you may have to do a few things to them. And if you're prepared to get your hands dirty, it means running them is a lot cheaper than paying somebody to fix them. I think the most essential tool in your toolbox is some sort of diagnostics unit. I use something called a nanocom, but I believe there are several other options out there. They plug into the OBD port, onboard diagnostics. You know, I think with a vehicle like this, if you have fault codes, you need something like that to be able to A, diagnose them, and B, clear them. And if you're not prepared to buy something like that along with the vehicle, you're just asking for trouble. I would say they're also very capable off-road. I think these actually off-road nicer than the newer independent models, especially with the four-wheel traction control. You're not limited traction-wise at all, and suspension offers a lot more flex, or at least a lot more stability than the independent air suspension does.